Did you ever wonder why it is that most people are programmed to sleep at night instead of during the day? If there's something about the cycle of light and dark that's telling us when to sleep, then shouldn't the sleep cycle of a blind person be different? As it turns out, many blind people, people with no visual perception of light at all, do have the same sleep cycle as sighted people. So now you're wondering, how can this happen? The answer is hormones. One hormone in particular. It's called melatonin. In sighted people, the level of melatonin goes up at night, or when it's dark, and goes down in the day, or when it's light. It's believed that it's the presence of this hormone in the blood that gives us the urge to sleep.
Welcome to the Four Winds Historical Farm, where traditions of the past are preserved for visitors like you. Today, our master thatchers will begin giving this barn behind me a sturdy thatched roof, able to withstand heavy winds and last up to 100 years. How do they do it? Well, in a nutshell, it involves covering the beams or rafters, the wooden skeleton of a roof, with reeds or straw. Our thatchers here have harvested their own natural materials for the job, the bundles of water reeds you see lying over there beside the barn. Thatching is certainly uncommon in the United States today. I guess that's why so many of you have come to see this demonstration. Before we start our first lab, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the workbook we'll be using. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the workbook contains a very large amount of material, far more than you could ever handle in a single semester. What you're supposed to do is choose the experiments and activities that you want to do, within a certain framework, of course. Part of my job is to help you make your choices. Next, I'd like to mention that in each workbook chapter, there are usually two subsections. The first is called Experiments, and the second is called Activities. In the Experiments section, the workbook gives full instructions for all the experiments, including alternate procedures. Choose the procedure you wish. There's plenty of equipment available. In the Activities section, you will find suggestions for projects that you can do on your own time.
Word comes from California of a new weapon in the war on household pests. Two scientists working for a firm in Anaheim, California, have developed a method to eliminate insects without using dangerous chemicals. The new poison? Hot air. The basic idea is that insects cannot adjust to temperatures much above normal. In laboratory experiments, cockroaches and termites can't survive much more than a quarter of an hour at 125 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 50 degrees centigrade. The new method involves covering a house with a huge tent and filling it with air heated to around 65 degrees centigrade. Hot air is forced in with fans, and the tent keeps the heat inside the house.
I'm sure you realize that your research papers are due in 6 weeks. I've looked at your proposed topics and made comments about them. The most frequent problem was proposing too broad a topic. Remember, this is only a 15-page paper. As I return your topic papers, I'd like to look over the schedule out what we'll do during the next 2 weeks. Today is Monday. By Friday, I want your preliminary outline. Please be sure to incorporate the suggestions I've made on your topics in your outlines. Next week, I'll have a conference with each of you. I've posted a schedule on my office door. Sign your name time you're available for an appointment. In the conference, we'll discuss your preliminary outline. Then you can make the necessary revisions and hand in your final outline, which is due 2 weeks from today. Use the outline.
It seems like only yesterday that I was sitting where you are, just finishing my first year of medical school, and wondering if I'd ever get a chance to use all my new knowledge on a real live patient. Well, I have good news for you. You don't have to wait until your 3rd or 4th year of medical school hands-on experience. The dean has invited me here to tell you about the university's Rural Opportunities Program. If you enroll in this program, you can have the opportunity this summer, after your first year of medical school, to spend from 4 to 6 weeks observing and assisting a real physician, like me, in a small city. You won't have to compete with other students for time and attention, and you can see what life as a country doctor is really like. The program was designed to encourage medical students like yourselves to consider careers in rural communities that are still understaffed. It seems that
Current studies show that what goes on labels is an important consideration for manufacturers, since more than 70% of shoppers read food labels when considering whether to buy a product. A recent controversy as to whether labels on prepared foods should educate or merely inform the consumer is over, and it got its way. The group had maintained that product labels should do more than simply list how many grams of nutrients a food contains. Their contention was that labels should also list the percentage of a day's total nutrients that the product will supply to the consumer, because this information is essential in planning a healthy diet. A government agency disagreed strongly, favoring a label that merely informs the consumer. In other words, a label that only lists the contents of the product. The agency maintained
Last week, we talked about Anne Bradstreet and the role of women in the Puritan colonies. Today, I want to talk about some other women who've contributed to American history, some famous and some not so famous. The first woman I'd like to talk about is Molly Pitcher. Those of you who are familiar with the name may know her as a hero of the American Revolution. But in fact, there never was a woman named Molly Pitcher. Her real name was actually Mary Ludwig Hayes. She got the nickname Molly Pitcher for her acts of bravery during the Revolutionary War. As the story goes, when Mary's, or Molly's, husband, John Hayes, enlisted in the artillery, Mary followed, like many other wives did. She helped out doing washing and cooking for the soldiers. She was known to be a pretty unusual woman. She smoked a pipe and chewed tobacco.
Today we're going to talk about shyness and discuss recent research on ways to help children learn to interact socially. Many people consider themselves shy. In fact, 40% of the people who took part in our survey said they were shy. That's 2 out of every 5 people. And there are studies to indicate that the tendency toward shyness may be inherited. But just because certain children are timid doesn't mean they are doomed to be shy forever. There are things parents, teachers, and the children themselves can do to overcome this tendency, and even to prevent it. One researcher found that if parents gently push their shy children to try new things, they can help these children become less afraid and less inhibited. Another way to help shy children is to train them in social skills. Welcome to Yellowstone National Park. Before we begin our nature walk today, I'd like to give you a short history of our National Park Service. The National Park Service began in the late 1800s. A small group of explorers had just completed a month-long exploration of the region that is now Yellowstone. They gathered around a campfire, and after hours of discussion, they decided that they should not claim this land for themselves. They felt it should be accessible to everyone. So they began a campaign to preserve this land for everyone's enjoyment. 2 years later, in the late 19th century, an act of Congress signed by President Ulysses S. Grant proclaimed the Yellowstone region a public park. It was the first national park in the world.
I need to make sure you understand how to get housing for next year. When you entered as first-year students this year, the school assigned you to a dorm and a roommate. But next year, as returning students, you'll choose both your roommate and your dorm. But whether or not you actually get to live in your first choice depends on what number you or your roommate draws in the lottery system. The system gives priority to the students who have been here longest. Fourth-year students get the first block of numbers. Third years get the second block, and second years, like you'll be, get the third. The lower the number you draw, the sooner you choose. Number 1 gets the first choice. Number 2 gets the second choice, and so on. You can use either your own or your intended roommate's number to make your room choice.
So why did what is now called modern dance begin in the United States? To begin to answer this question, I'll need to backtrack a little bit and talk about classical ballet. By the late 1800s, ballet had lost a lot of its popularity. Most of the ballet dancers who performed in the United States were brought over from Europe. They performed using the rigid techniques that had been passed down through the centuries. Audiences and dancers in the United States were eager for their own contemporary dance form, and so, around 1900, dancers created one. So, how was this modern dance so different from classical ballet? Well, most notably, it wasn't carefully choreographed. Instead, the dance depended on the improvisation and free personal expression of the dancers. Human populations near the equator have evolved dark skin over many generations because of exposure to the fierce rays of the sun. A similar phenomenon has also occurred in other parts of the animal kingdom. The African grass mouse is a good example. Most mice are nocturnal, but the African grass mouse is active during daylight hours. This means that it spends its days searching for food in the semi-dry bush and scrub habitats of eastern and southern Africa. Its fur is striped like a chipmunk's, which helps it blend in with its environment. Because it spends a lot of time in the intense tropical sun, the grass mouse has also evolved two separate safeguards against the sun's ultraviolet radiation. First, like the populations of humans in this region of the world, the skin of the grass mouse contains lots of melanin, or dark pigment. Second, and quite unusual, this mouse has a layer of melanin-pigmented tissue between its skull and skin.
We're going to start today talking about congressional aides. That is, the people who work for our congressional representatives, both in Washington and in the representatives' local districts. It used to be that members of Congress had a relatively small staff of people working for them, and the role of these people wasn't of primary importance. But now there are thousands of congressional aides, and they've profoundly affected the way the whole government works. Congressional aides work in two different locations, one in the congressional representatives' local offices, the districts from which they were elected, and two in Washington. Staff in the local offices help members of Congress stay in touch with citizens in their districts. These citizens can bring problems in person or by mail or phone. This personal connection between the aides and the local people can be helpful when the next election comes around.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to continue our discussion of human evolution by looking at Homo erectus, the earliest of our ancestors who stood upright. Homo erectus lived about 1.5 million years ago and was given that name because, at the time the first fossil was discovered, it represented the first primate to stand upright. There is evidence now that Homo erectus had sharper mental skills than their predecessors. They constructed the first standardized tool for hunting and butchering. They created an extraordinary stone implement, a large teardrop-shaped hand axe, whose design and symmetry reveal a keen sense of aesthetics. This detailing, along with the axe's utilitarian value, strongly suggests that Homo erectus had the ability to conceive of and execute a design to specification. In addition, Homo erectus was the first hominid to use fire.
Now let's focus on comics in the 1950s. Early in the decade, sales were down, so publishers started looking for some new angle to get their readers interested again. They found what they were looking for with horror comics, stories about ghosts and demons that were often graphically violent. Before long, most of the major publishers were printing horror comics. But it all came to an end a few years later. You see, there was a psychologist named Frederick Wortham who claimed that comic books, the horror books in particular, were a bad influence on children and turned them into juvenile delinquents. Wortham even wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent that showed specific scenes from comics that he thought were a particularly bad influence on kids.
A language dies when the last person who speaks it dies. But you know, sometimes people say it dies when the second last person who speaks it dies, because then the last person has nobody to talk to. Well, of course, languages have come and gone throughout history as keys have come and gone. But what's happening now is something really quite extraordinary. Well, there are about 6,000 languages in the world at the moment, more or less. Nobody knows the exact number. And of these, people think that about half of them are so seriously endangered that they're likely to die out in the course of the present century. Now, the present century is 100 years, half is 3,000 languages, so that means one language is dying out somewhere in the world, on average, every 2 weeks.
Let's take a look at this video of these little kids. They were offered the option of having one marshmallow immediately or 2 marshmallows 15 minutes later. And you've got some very cute videotape of this experiment, so let's take a look. Okay.
What we found is a very simple and direct way of measuring a competence that seems to make an important life difference.
A researcher tells these preschoolers that she's going to leave the room. If they wait for her to come back without eating the marshmallows, they'll get 2 marshmallows. Or they can ring the bell and she'll come back right away. But then they only get 1 marshmallow.
I won't ring the bell.
You won't ring the bell? Okay. Looking at children over time, Dr. Michelle has found that being able to wait longer at 4 has some pretty powerful implications.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you hear the term robot, but I'm going to show you the very, very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute, cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, finished. That had a devastating impact across Europe. And so people were kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kind of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play.
This busy little town is named after St David's first cousin. It's also a Welsh language stronghold. According to the 2001 census results, 70% of the town's population could speak Welsh. But even here, the language may not be completely safe. The Welsh Language Board expects last year's census result to show a fall in the number of Welsh speakers living in its northern and western heartlands. One of the main reasons for that, the board says, is migration. Many Welsh speakers are choosing to leave the country. At the same time, only a small percentage of those moving in can speak the language or choose to learn it.
Historically, over the past 70, 80 years, Welsh people have continually left in order to find better standard of pay, maybe, and quality of employment.
With the help of the wealthy countries such as US, Vietnam became second largest coffee producer and exporter. This impacted other coffee producers like Colombia. The lecture is about the changes that have taken place in coffee production. Coffee production increased from 6 billion to 30 billion. The huge demand of Europe and America had Vietnam the second biggest producer, which has greatly affected Colombia's production. The output of Central America is witnessing dramatic decrease. People's drinking habit also undergoing changes. Coffee was introduced to Vietnam in 1857 by the French and slowly grew as producer of coffee in Asia. I'm a computer science and engineering professor here in Carnegie Mellon, and my research focuses on usable privacy. And so my friends like to give me examples of their frustrations with computing systems, especially frustrations related to usable privacy and security. Excuse me, so passwords are somethings that I hear a lot about. A lot of people are frustrated with passwords, and it's bad enough when you have to have one really good password that you can remember, but nobody else is going to able to guess. But what do you do when you have accounts on 100 different systems and you're supposed to have a unique password for each of these systems? It's tough. At Carnegie Mellon, they used to make it actually pretty easy for us to remember our passwords. The password requirement up through 2009 was just that you had to have a password with at least one character. Hausmanns Renovation of Paris was a vast public works program commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III and directed by his prefect of the Seine, Georges-Eugène Haussmann, between 1853 and 1870. It included the demolition of crowded and unhealthy medieval neighborhoods, the building of wide avenues, parks and squares, the annexation of the suburbs surrounding Paris, and the construction of new sewers, fountains and aqueducts. Haussmann's work met with fierce opposition, and he was finally dismissed by Napoleon III in 1870, but work on his projects continued until 1927. The street plan and distinctive appearance of the center of Paris today is largely the result of Hausmann's renovation. In the middle of the 19th century, the center of Paris was overcrowded, dark, dangerous, and unhealthy.
But I'm going to focus on today is really different, larger forms of genetic variation involving essentially gains, losses, and inversions of sequence. So showing here is 30 in a simple diagram. We have an example of some structural variation operationally defined as events greater than a kb in size. So we have pieces of DNA that sometimes become deleted. We have pieces of DNA that sometimes become duplicated on chromosomes and regions which can be, in fact, inverted or turned around with respect to another orientation. So this very busy map here represents probably about 3 years of work in my lab, just to kind of characterize the general pattern of structural variation in 8 human genomes.
Western country child birth rates. In the Western countries, women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rates increased during the early 20th century, but it started to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as example, the birth rate remained at around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to their lowest point that has ever been seen in society. It also has impacts on males in society, especially young males. And it might even have some connection with unemployment rates as well.
When Australians engage in debate about educational quality or equity, they often seem to accept that a country cannot achieve both at the same time. Curriculum reforms intended to improve equity often fail to do so because they increase breadth or differentiation in offerings in a way that increases differences in quality. Further, these differences in quality reflect differences in students' social backgrounds because the new offerings are typically taken up by relatively disadvantaged students who are not served well them. Evidence from New South Wales will be used to illustrate this point. The need to improve the quality of education is well accepted across OECD and other countries as they seek to strengthen their human capital to underpin their modern, knowledge economies. Improved equity is also important for this purpose, since the demand for high-level skills is widespread and the opportunities for the low-skilled are diminishing.
The Right Honourable Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was a British statesman, best known as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. At various times a soldier, journalist, author, and politician, Churchill is generally regarded as one of the most important leaders in British and world history. Considered reactionary on some issues, such as granting independence to Britain's colonies, and at times regarded as a self-promoter who changed political parties to further his career. It was his wartime leadership that earned him iconic status. Some of his peacetime decisions, such as restoring the gold standard in 1924, were disastrous, as was his World War I decision to land troops on the Dardanelles.
A mild form of hallucination is known as a disturbance, and can occur in most of the senses above. These may be things like seeing movement in peripheral vision, or hearing faint noises and/or voices. Auditory hallucinations are very common in schizophrenia. They may be benevolent, telling the subject good things about themselves, or malicious, cursing the subject, etc. Auditory hallucinations of the malicious type are frequently heard, for example people talking about the subject behind his/her back. Like auditory hallucinations, the source of the visual counterpart can also be behind the subject's back. Their visual counterpart is the feeling of being looked or stared at, usually with malicious intent. Frequently, auditory hallucinations and their visual counterpart are experienced by the subject together.
This course provides students with an in-depth understanding of the exciting disciplines of politics and international relations. Students will learn about the workings of political institutions in countries around the world and explore the complex field of relations between nations. Topics in governments, public policy, public administration, national security, and border control ensure that students receive a broad and current education in the range of issues which are covered under the label of politics and international relations. Students will undertake 4 compulsory units in 2 majors, one in politics and international relations and the other in governments and policy. They will also choose an elective major from a wide choice of options, including political communication, international studies, international business, and national security studies.
Our friends at the Highlands Museum and Discovery Centre in Ashland, Kentucky, asked a very good question. Why is it dark in space? That question is not as simple as it may sound. You might think that space appears dark at night because that is when our side of Earth faces away from the sun as our planet rotates on its axis every 24 hours. But what about all those other faraway suns that appear as stars in the night sky? Our own Milky Way contains over 200 billion stars, and the entire universe contains over 100 billion galaxies. You might suppose that that many stars would light the night sky like daytime. Until the 20th century, astronomers didn't think it was even possible to count all the stars in the universe.
Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life an innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe.
And so this is one picture that probably you all know what it is when you see it. It's a familiar looking image. It's something that probably we all have some personal experience with, right? This is a chest X-ray that would be taken in your doctor's office, for example, or a radiologist's office. And it is a good example of biomedical engineering in that it takes a physical principle, that is, how do X-rays interact with the tissues of your body, and it uses that physics, that physical principle, to develop a picture of what's inside your body. So to look inside and see things that you couldn't see without this device. And you'll recognize some of the parts of the image. You can see the rib cage here, the bones. You can see the heart is this large, bright object down here. If you're have good eyesight from the distance that you're at, you can see the vessels leading out of the heart and into the lungs, and the lungs are these darker spaces within the rib cage.
Turner, not surprisingly, painted one of the earliest pictures of London's fog in the 1835 painting The Thames Above Waterloo Bridge. Turner, as a true-born Londoner, is advertising his familiarity with London's air problem by putting smoke and atmospheric pollution at its centre. And as you can see in here, the bridge is the central element, which is a theme that's later taken up by Monet. And it's partly obscured by the steam and smoke which rises from both sides of the river. Here we see a shot tower, I think you can just about see it, which was constructed in 1826. Do you know what shot towers are? They produce shot for guns, ammunition, and they were very smoky, one of the more smoky industries.
There's sugar in a lot of foods where you don't expect it. And of course, you know, there's lots of sugar in donuts or ice cream or pastries or other things that are sweet, candy of course. But there are other places where you see it and you don't necessarily expect it. So as an example, peanut butter. Here's a list of ingredients from Skippy peanut butter, and you see that sugar is the second most common ingredient. Excuse me, you may know from reading food labels that these ingredients in any food label are listed in order of how much there is in the food itself. So sugar comes right after peanuts. Here's another example, beef stew. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find sugar in beef stew, but it's there.
Welcome to your very first tutorial in biology. Now, in this video series, what I want to do is I want to talk to you guys about many different topics concerning biology. For example, I want to talk to you guys about DNA and genetics and cells and bacteria and life and a whole bunch of interesting stuff. But since this is the very first video, I think what we should do in this video is just stick with the very basics. And the first thing I want to do is talk to you guys about what is biology. So let's go ahead and answer that question. And the definition of biology is this: the study of life and living organisms. Alright, that makes sense up to a certain point, up until organisms, because you may have heard of organisms before, and you may have your own definition, but the scientific definition of an organism is a living thing.
As Joanne pointed out, only one country, tiny little Bhutan, wedged between China and India, has adopted the gross national happiness as the central index of government policy, and actually has had a good deal of success in education and in health and in economic growth and in environmental preservation, and they have a rather sophisticated way of measuring the effects of different policies on people's happiness. But they are the only country to go that far. But you're now beginning to get other countries interested enough to do kind of white paper policy analyses about whether happiness research, what effects would it have if we used it more for public policy. You're beginning to get countries like Australia, France, Great Britain that are considering publishing regular statistics on happiness. So it's beginning to become a subject of greater interest for policymakers and legislators in different advanced countries.
Welcome to today's lesson. We are continuing with our study of taxonomy. Taxonomy is how scientists classify organisms into different groups based on the characteristics that they share. So for instance, a good way to think about taxonomy is the U.S. Postal Service. If we want to send a letter to someone, we first start off by addressing it to the nation they're in. By default, we usually assume that's America, but it doesn't have to be. It could be England or Costa Rica or Spain. You put their nation or their kingdom. Then within that kingdom, you address it to a slightly more specific level, their state. So for instance, South Carolina would be the same as a phylum. Then within that state, you would address it to their city, and then to their street number, the street they live on.
So, what do we mean by well-being? Health, happiness, a sense of achievement and contentment, a state of mind and body where people can thrive. Well-being is not something that is purely limited to people who are facing extraordinary challenges in their lifestyle, health, or personal circumstances. Everybody here has a level of well-being. Music so often forms an intuitive part of our well-being management. Music to pick us up, music to calm us down, music to heal our sorrows. Our aim, through research, is to move from this level of intuitive application of music through to informed use in our communities, to take the next step in the understanding of the power of music in human life. Music already works for us on so many levels, whether it's soothing and teaching our infants, bringing people and communities together, adding spirit to our work and personal endeavors. But there is no reason to stop here.
A new study of fish called sticklebacks shows that shy individuals actually prefer to follow fish that are similarly timid. This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Karen Hopkin. This'll just take a minute. Researchers had trios of sticklebacks with known personalities play follow the leader. The fish were placed in a tank that had some plastic plants at one end and some food hidden at the other. In some of the groups, a bold fish and a shy fish acted as leaders, while another shy fish followed. And in other groups, it was a bold fish that did the following. The researchers recorded whether the follower sallied forth more frequently with the behaviorally similar or the one that was different. What they found is that shy fish were more likely to emerge from under cover when an equally
But we can really thank the great exhibition of 1851 for giving us the world's premier taxi service. For it was going to this exhibition, this fabulous exhibition of inventions from all around the four corners of the empire, that the visitors were appalled, dismayed and vexed by their journeys to this exhibition, because the cabbies of the day in their horse-drawn carts were absolutely terrible, could not find their way to this exhibition. And so, at great public outcry, the London authorities set up the Public Carriage Office, which is an organisation that still exists. You can take a short walk to Penton Street up the road. And this Public Carriage Office took on the responsibility of licensing all major taxi drivers in London. All taxi drivers from 1851 onwards had to pass what is now known as the London Knowledge, this phenomenal knowledge of London.
Now, the economists calculated, it's a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that removing all immigration controls would double the size of the world economy, and even a small relaxation of immigration controls would lead to disproportionately big gains. Now, for an ethical point of view, it's hard to argue against a policy that will do so much to help people that are much poorer than ourselves. The famous RAND study reckons that a typical immigrant who arrives in U.S. ends up with $20,000 a year. That's rough. It's not just the migrants themselves who gain, it's the countries they come from. Already, the migrants working for poor countries, working in rich countries, send home around $200 billion a year. Through formal channels, and about twice as that through informal channels.
I have said before that you can't have a civilization that doesn't have art. When we think about the great civilizations historically, all of them had great production of culture and art because a society has to be able to observe itself. And the sophistication of the great civilizations were their ability to look at themselves. And what allows a society to do that are the producers of art and culture. It would mirror back to the core of the society exactly what is being produced at that moment, how people are thinking of themselves, and how individuals are relating to the social structure at that time. Art is the vehicle through which we understand that. Were you to take away art, what would be that mirror? How would we see what we are about? How would we understand what was going on in Paris at the time of the Impressionists when people were learning to see in a completely different way?
So when we talk about the polar regions, just to clarify exactly what we mean, we have first of all the Arctic at the top of the Earth and the Antarctic at the bottom. So the Arctic was named after the Greek word for bear. Now surprisingly it's not after the polar bears that live in the Arctic, but it's after the Little and Great Bear constellations that can be seen in the sky. Now the Greeks also hypothesized that there would be an anti-Arctic, which is how we get the name Antarctica. But of course it wasn't discovered until much later on. Now these regions are opposite in many ways other than just their names and their location on the globe. So if we look at the Arctic first of all, the Arctic is actually ocean surrounded by land.
In 1943, what became known as the Green Revolution began when Mexico, unable to feed its growing population, shouted for help. Within a few years, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations founded the International Rice Research Institute in Asia, and by 1962, a new strain of rice called IR8 was feeding people all over the world. IR8 was the first really big modified crop to make a real impact on world hunger. In 1962, the technology did not yet exist to directly manipulate the genes of plants, and so IR8 was created by carefully crossing existing varieties, selecting the best from each generation, further modifying them, and finally finding the best.
I want you to try and remember two things. First, I want you to try and remember learning how to ride a bike. Maybe you have a scar you received when you flipped over the handlebars. The next thing I want you to remember is how to ride a bike. The reason I asked you to recall both of these memories is that they belong to two different designated realms of memory. Memory is a fluid and dynamic system that is exceedingly complicated. To this end, psychologists have attempted to divide memory up to make it easier to study. There are two main categories. Explicit memory is a memory that can be intentionally and consciously recalled. This is your memory of riding a bike, of falling over the handlebars and skinning your knee. The other is implicit memory, which is an experiential or functional form of memory that cannot be consciously recalled.
The Earth's temperature is rising, and as it does, springtime phenomena, like the first bloom of flowers, are getting earlier and earlier. But rising temperatures aren't the only factor. Urban light pollution is also quickening the coming of spring.
So temperature and light are really contributing to a double whammy of making everything earlier.
Richard French Constant, an entomologist at the University of Exeter. He and his colleagues compiled 13 years of data from citizen scientists in the UK who tracked the first bud burst of 4 common trees. And it turns out light pollution from street lights in cities and along roads pushed bud burst a full week earlier, way beyond what rising temperatures could achieve.
So that creates tensions, and that's what I want to talk about, because I think it's important that we are, as a society, able to have an informed debate about how much privacy is enough but not too much, how much security is enough but not too much. Privacy is a human right. That's simply quoting the Universal Declaration. In the physical world, we've got all kinds of protections. This is evidence that we care about our privacy. We've got doors, we've got obscured glass, we've got locks. We wear clothes. We put up shutters. And technology continues to erode the privacy that exists in the real world, in the 3 spatial dimensions. Security cameras, automatic number plate recognition take away anonymity. Long lenses, paparazzi, take away distance and the privacy that used to create. And body scanners are increasingly being used to see through clothes, for example.
All my research, and that I conducted with my 60-plus graduate students, was motivated by the need to learn so that we can teach. Of course, some inventions happened along the way, but I have always considered that the end result, I always considered these inventions to be byproducts of the learning process. The end product for me was always better understanding, or when one really succeeded, a unifying theory that can help us in teaching the subject. I have also looked at teaching as a vehicle to try new ideas. or new ways of doing things on an intelligent group of learners. That is, as a vehicle for teaching research results. In my experience, this kind of teaching is the most stimulating and motivating to students. I have also uncovered many interesting research problems in the course of teaching a subject.
Today we're going to recount heroic tales of superhuman feats of strength, when in the face of disaster, some people are said to have summoned up incredible physical power to lift a car off of an accident victim, move giant rocks, or like Big John of song, single-handedly hold up a collapsing beam to let the other miners escape. Are such stories true? There are many anecdotes supporting the idea, but we're going to take a fact-based look at whether or not it truly is possible for an adrenaline-charged person to temporarily gain massive strength. In proper terminology, such a temporary boost of physical power would be called hysterical strength. The stories are almost always in the form of one person lifting a car off of another. In each of these cases, some aspect of leverage or buoyancy probably played some role in reducing the magnitude of the feat to something more believable.
During this time, my goals are going to be to talk about the phenomenon that we may share in part with other animals and our language, and that is emotion. And also talk about some new technology, brain imaging, functional magnetic imaging, and we try to answer some very old questions about how does motivation and emotion work. I'm going to put you with the scenario first, and some of you may be familiar with it. This was developed by Pavlov over a century ago. And in this scenario, the dog presented with the sound. The dog waits and then feeds food powder, and this happened repeatedly. Things starts to happen in the middle of the experiment there.